now that we understand the difference between observational studies and design experiments, we want to break down observational studies a little bit more. Observational studies are really, really common. It's because they're so much cheaper than experiments. Experiments are actually very, very expensive, especially if they're going to be well done with control groups and all of that. All right, so there are three major categories of observational studies. There's cross-sectional studies, which are when observational studies collect information about individuals at a specific point in time or over a very short period of time. So, for example, a poll of NBA players in May 2020 was taken by their union to gauge interest in returning from the COVID-19 pandemic for a shortened season in 2020, which, as I record this, is currently underway. Well, it hasn't started yet, but they're practicing. So that's a poll. It's a snapshot in time at a very specific moment. So that would be a cross-sectional study. Very, very common. When you poll people about that kind of thing, that's cross-sectional. A case control is retrospective. So it requires individuals to look back in time or require the researcher to look at existing records. So I look at the last 50 years records of heart attack rates, that kind of thing. As a matter of fact, that's what was done in this particular example. This is a real study of myocardial infarctions, heart attack rates, among smokers and non-smokers. So if you study those over, a 40-year period, you're looking back over existing records. In case control studies, individuals who have certain characteristics are matched against those who do not. It's kind of a control group, but it's not a control group that the researchers manipulate. So in this case, the non-smokers, say, would be the group that does not have the characteristic, and smokers would be the group that does have the characteristic. And you're seeing if that explanatory variable of smoking and non-smoking affects the heart attack rates. And yes, that was a real study also. A cohort study is when these are actually quite expensive as well as just like experiments are, but it's when you identify a group of individuals to participate in the study, i.e. the cohort, and that cohort is then observed over a long period of time. And over that period of time, characteristics about the individuals are recorded. Because the data is collected over time, cohort studies are called prospective. So this is a prospective study. You're recording everything over the period of time. Retrospective is looking back. So you're looking back at existing things or looking back in time. One of the most famous examples, not the most famous, but one of the most famous examples is the nursing study. It's so famous. There's the tobacco use myocardial infarction one if you want to see it. But the nurses' health study is so famous, it has its own Wikipedia page. It was originally established in 1976. And basically, they grabbed groups of nurses, large groups, as a matter of fact. If you look in 1976, there was 121,000 nurses that were being watched and tracked over a period of time. And then as that group aged, they record, and they still are tracking that group, as a matter of fact. This is still ongoing. So they track that group of nurses over a period of time. Now, why nurses? Well, because what they're trying to do is control for confounding and lurking variables, right? So by having everybody be people that are well educated about health, i.e. nurses, and all have college degrees to a certain extent, nurses, you're controlling for other variables, right? So it's a fascinating study, and it's a long-term cohort study. But of course, it is expensive to keep track of all of those people. That's 121,000 people. And I don't know if you noticed, but they've actually done re-uppings of the study. So they start with another group in, I believe, the 80s, and then another group later. And so they're tracking all of those nurses over courses of their lifetime, really. I mean, as long as the study can keep going, they will keep tabs on all of those people and keep asking them questions and so on. Now, there are other sources of data for observational studies that we want to just kind of talk about. The census. Now, a census is a study that obtains every member of a population, right? So that would be a census. So if you're able to get a hold of everybody. In most studies, a census is not practical because it takes so much time and money to gather everybody that it's just, and quite frankly, even then, some people will be like, no, I'm not going to answer. So a census is really hard to do. For example, the U.S. Census, they try every 10 years to gather everybody in the U.S. and they never ever succeed. They never have once gotten everybody in the U.S. They're not even close. But they do get a large percentage of the U.S. population. And then we can discuss in what ways do they miss the mark, but that's a whole other discussion. The age and inauguration of every U.S. president. So that would be an easy one. We know how many presidents there have been. It's not that hard to figure out how old they were, and that's it. So that would be easy to do a census of. Whereas the US Census is, of 300 million people, or however many there are in the year you're watching this, and that's really hard to do. Now, web scraping is a more modern thing. That's all with the rise of computers. So, Facebook, Google, Twitter, that's what they're doing. So, they're tracking you. They're tracking your data. They're extracting that data from your profiles and everything, and they're selling it to advertisers. That's how Facebook keeps itself going, right? Twitter as well. So, there are other ways to do this, but basically, you create a computer program and it scrapes data off of websites. I've seen it done for NBA statistics, and they'll go in and scrape the data. I've seen it done for the IMDb database of movies, and you can create a program that'll scrape the running times of every movie on there, that kind of thing. So it's like it goes through the internet code of that website and it grabs information. So it's observational because you're just gathering data from this source. And then, of course, there's lots of publicly available data for observational studies. So if you're looking at the kind of study where you're trying to look at existing records, there's a lot of publicly available data that you can get. Government agencies such as the CDC, the National Center for Education, Department of Ed, Department of Health, all of those government agencies, companies often have publicly available data. I mean, stock prices alone. Sports organizations like the NBA and the National Hockey League. As a matter of fact, I went and grabbed data from these for different examples for both the homework worksheets and for the notes. They all regularly make their data available, so you can just go get it. Or sometimes it's for a nominal fee, that kind of thing. So for some examples, if you're interested, Gapminder is really great, CDC, ESPN. ESPN has tons of sports data that you can get. 538 is a famous one for sports data as well as political data. Kaggle is another one. So there's lots and lots of publicly available data sets that researchers go gather information from. Well, again, examples like this, or definitions like this, don't really do us any good without some examples to kind of help cement it in our brain. So for each study below, we're going to determine the explanatory and response variable, and then whether it was an observational or designed experiment. It's an observational study or design experiment. And if the study is observational, we're going to determine whether it was cross-sectional, case control, or cohort. A Jackson College researcher wants to measure whether the campus a student takes the majority of their courses, so Jackson, Lenawee, Hillsdale Online, has an impact on the completion rate, that is, obtaining the degree. The researcher gathers the records for all students in the last 5 years and compares the percentage of students that obtain a degree for these locations. This absolutely happens. Colleges do this kind of thing all the time. They usually have a whole office devoted to gathering data about things like this. Now, the explanatory variable is the campus. It's Jackson, Lenawee, Hillsdale Online. And then the response variable would be the completion rate. So you can see right here, that's X, and right here, that's Y. So completion rate. All right, now what kind of experiment is it, or observational study? Well, it's not an experiment because they didn't manipulate students. It's not like they say, you're going to take your classes in Lenawee. I don't want to take them in Lenawee. No, you're right. So that design experiment is out. So that means it's observational. So it's one of these three. Well, it's not a cohort because they're not tracking a group over time. It's retrospective, right? Because they're looking back at past records, right? So that means it's a case control observational study. Next, a food scientist wants to compare the flavor of McDonald's fries made with beef tallow, the original method, until 1990. And then, I remember those fries, I'm old enough. And then vegetable oil, which is the current method. They use identical potatoes and cooking times to make the fries. That's trying to control for confounding right there. That's why they do that. Identical potatoes and so on is to try to make it so they don't have confounding problems. The fries are then numbered, and a group of people who don't know which is which taste test them and rate them on a variety of traits such as flavor, texture, and crispiness on a scale of 1 to 10. This is an actual experiment. It's an experiment because the researchers are manipulating things. It's an experiment that I heard about on this podcast called Revisionist History. Number 19, McDonald's broke my heart because the old ones taste better. All right, so this is the frying method. And then this would be the response variable would be basically the tastiness of the fries, right? The flavor, texture, crispiness. So it's the taste of the fries. Let's just leave it at that. Taste has a variety of components to it, such as, flavor, texture, what it looks like, etc. So that's a designed experiment completely because the researchers manipulated what was going on. And it's a very interesting listen if you're interested in the podcast because it really happens. All right, now a total of 974 homeless women in in the Los Angeles area were surveyed to determine their level of satisfaction with the healthcare provided by shelter clinics versus the healthcare provided by government clinics. The women reported greater quality satisfaction with the shelter and outreach clinics compared to the government clinics. Okay, so its type of clinic is the explanatory variable because that's changing from woman to woman. And then satisfaction with the clinics, right? Or clinic satisfaction, let me put it that way, right? How happy are they with their service, right, at the two types of clinics? All right, now that is not a designed experiment. It's not that they manipulated them and said, you're randomly selected to go to the government clinic, and you're randomly selected to go to the shelter clinic, right? They didn't do that, right? So design experiment is out, which means it's observational. They're not tracking these women over the course of 30 years, so that's out, right? They're really just getting a snapshot in time of how they feel about the clinics right now, which means it's cross-sectional, which a lot of surveys are. Most surveys are asking people, how do you feel about it at this moment? That's cross-sectional. When it's at the moment, that's cross-sectional. All right. Last but not least, there was too much, so I couldn't fit it all into one page. This is a very famous study. For 40 years, between 1932 and 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service, which I don't think exists anymore, measured the effect of the late stages of syphilis on 399 African American men. If you know anything about syphilis, you know that's not good because syphilis makes you go crazy. Literally, it turns your brain into mush. It ruins the connective tissues in your brain. So if it goes untreated, it can be treated with penicillin. So these men, mostly illiterate sharecroppers from one of the poorest counties in Alabama, were never told what disease they were suffering from or its seriousness. Informed that they were being treated for bad blood, quote unquote, their doctors had no intention of curing them of syphilis at all, which of course in the 1930s they could not have cured them because in the 1930s we did not have penicillin. Penicillin, which can cure syphilis as long as it's given in the early stages, was invented in 1947, but it was never given to the patients. Data was collected from the autopsies of the men, and they were thus deliberately left to degenerate under the ravages of syphilis, which can include tumors, heart disease, paralysis, blindness, insanity, and death. All right. If you're thinking, that's terrible, yes, it is terrible. It's highly unethical. We'll talk about that. All right, but let's get to it. The explanatory variable, the response variable. So the explanatory variable is the treatment that these people are receiving or lack thereof, right? So if they're not going to treat them, right, that would normally be, what's our treatment? What's our response? So what are we treating? And then how did the disease change? But they're not doing that because they're not treating them at all. So if they have no intention of curing them, then what they're doing is seeing, hey, what is syphilis if it goes untreated? So let's see, untreated syphilis. What effect does that have on them? That's literally what they were figuring out. So, hey, if we let this syphilis just go, what effect does it have on the health of these individuals, right? So it's the health of the men, right? Paralysis, blindness, heart disease, and so on. All right. This is a cohort study because they did track them for 40 years, from 1932 until 1972. Now, grant you, there was nothing keeping the individuals in the region where they were other than they tended to be illiterate, and they were sharecroppers, so they tended to be very poor farmers and African American farmers in the 1930s through the 1970s. So they were basically forced to stay in that area due to socioeconomic conditions, and a lot of them never received treatment and died of syphilis. All right, now this is super duper unethical. Where do we begin? So they did not treat them, they did not inform the patients. They actually lied to the patients about what they had. They, I don't even know where to put that, lied to the patients about what they had or didn't have. They told them they had bad blood and that there's nothing that can be done. It's awful. I know it's absolutely awful, but there's more to the story. So they lied to the patients. They did not treat the patients effectively, even when they had a cure. A cure was invented 15 years into the study, right, in 1947, but they kept going. Did not treat even when a cure for syphilis existed. There's more, so much more. They made it difficult for nurses and doctors to effectively do their job. Nurses and doctors would quit and protest, and then they would hush up their answers and results. I mean, it's just all sorts of things. So where do I begin? They took advantage of poor, illiterate African American men in Alabama. 1932 through 1972, that is a very, very dangerous years. Those are very, very dangerous years everywhere, obviously, for African American men. But Alabama is no much better, right? So this is dangerous territory. Right? All right. Now, when this was found out, this is so bad and so unethical that when the story of what happened started breaking, it was first started being reported on July 25th of 1972 in an article by Gene Heller of the Associated Press. There was a huge uproar. This was a national scandal, rightly so. This is a big, big problem. And this is quoting from the Wikipedia page, but I want to say it in full. In 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act and created a commission to study and write regulations governing studies involving human participants. Within the United States Department of Health and Human Services, the Office for Human Research Protections was established to oversee clinical trials. Now, studies require informed consent, communication of diagnosis, and accurate reporting of test results. Institutional review boards, including lay people, are established in scientific research groups and hospitals to review study protocols, protect patient interests, and ensure that participants are fully informed. All right, so when this happened, when people found out what was going on, it took a couple years. People were livid, and they established the Office for Human Research Protections. And I have friends that work in science. And so if they want to work with humans, actually, if they want to work with any animals and humans especially, everything has to be with humans informed consent. There are review boards, including lay people. That means people that are not necessarily scientists. They have to have average people research what's being done and make sure that it's ethical, make sure that patient interests are protected. All of that has to happen. Nurses and doctors, of course, often have to be part of these studies and part of these informed consents. So if you're going on to be a nurse, this is one of the reasons you have to jump through all the hoops that you do. Right. And I'm sorry to say that the Tuskegee study, which is very, very, very famous, the Tuskegee syphilis study, is not the only time that things like this have happened. So the Tuskegee study was seeing how syphilis affects a group that they already had syphilis. It was just not treating them effectively and lying to them about what they had. But there's actual cases of the US government infecting people as well in other countries purposefully. also sometimes infecting their own soldiers as well, and experimenting on their own soldiers, and experimenting on people, just civilians in other countries, just to see what would happen. So that also cannot take place due to the Office for Human Research Protections, at least in a scientific context. And thank goodness for that. So even though the study was horrible and racist, it did at least have that as a positive outcome. Although I'm sure the families involved would argue that wasn't the right way to go about this, and I would agree with them.